Okay, great. So I'm so glad to see so many dinosaur fans here. Anyone here like T-Rex? Especially among the young people. All right, good, yeah. I've loved T-Rex since I was a little kid. I'm told that when I was really small, I told my parents that when I grew up, I was going to be T-Rex, and they told me that wasn't going to happen. So apparently I said, okay, then I'll work on them. And so because of that, I actually stuck with that, you know, whether this is stubbornness or refusal to grow up, or if those are actually mutually exclusive, I don't know. But yeah, so I work on Tyrannosaurs, and so I'm here to talk about Tyrannosaurus Rex, but also some bigger aspects of the nature of science. And that's one of the best things about dinosaurs, is dinosaurs are in some ways the ambassadors of science, because they can help the public, and especially the young members of the public, understand that science isn't about knowing things. It's about learning how to learn about things, how we answer questions about the natural world. And I think far too often people think of science as just a body of knowledge you have to master. But it's through science that we're going to answer the problems that the world faces. And that's sort of the contribution that dinosaurs can make, that we can teach young people, and older people too, to think about scientific approaches to life and to the universe, to learn about amazing things, like Tyrannosaurs. So some of the main topics I'm going to cover is a little bit of introduction of Tyrannosaurus Rex and something about its discovery. I don't need to introduce too much about Tyrannosaurus Rex. It's the one species that everyone gets its name right. People will, for example, think they know our species, but people will often say Homo sapien. It's not. It's Homo sapiens. That's not a plural. It's the NS ending. It's just like an ING ending in English. So Homo sapien would be like thinkin' man. But then I'm going to talk about how we try to infer about the lifestyles of creatures where, you know, we can't be David Attenborough. We can't go out and watch the animals in the field anymore. They're not doing too much anymore. So we've got to infer their life habits by other types of evidence. And then a particular field of research that I was involved with, and that's a very growing field, which is tracing the origins of Tyrannosaurus and its kin. So Tyrannosaurus is a North American dinosaur. These dots represent the range of T-Rex in the western interior of the United States, from rocks with wonderful names like Hell Creek and Lance and Frenchman and Schollard and so forth. These are rocks from the very end of the age of dinosaurs out west. The places that Tyrannosaurus lived, this is a picture of North America, a reconstruction of the map of North America. This is actually before T-Rex lived. I'll show the next slide will be segueing into when it lived. Was at a time when, well, immediately before T-Rex, sea levels were much higher than present. So if you were to be transported back in time as a time traveler, you could have taken a boat from the Gulf of Mexico and sailed over Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, the Prairie Provinces, all the way to the Arctic Circle and never see land. But that changed at the very end of the age of dinosaurs as sea levels dropped. And Tyrannosaurus lived during this interval when sea levels were dropping, the coastlines were moving inland, and Tyrannosaurus moved inland with it. It's not inconceivable that someday we're going to find Tyrannosaurus Rex in the eastern half of North America. Unfortunately, we don't have terrestrial rocks of the right age at the moment to recognize that. People have known about Tyrannosaurus Rex since the beginning of the 20th century. Well, technically, since the end of the 19th century, there were some fragmentary specimens found in the initial burst of discovery of dinosaurs in the late 19th century. But a good picture of it didn't develop until the dawn of the 20th century from expeditions of the American Museum of Natural History and the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And in 1905, this animal was named by Henry Fairfield Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, given the name Tyrannosaurus Rex, which remains one of the best names in biological nomenclature, because it's really evocative. Tyrant, lizard, king. I mean, you don't get cooler than that. Actually, you almost do. In the same paper, Osborne named Dynamisaurus imperiosus, the imperial dynamic reptile, but that turned out to be a second specimen of Tyrannosaurus Rex, so it's the same animal. So this was the initial attempt to reconstruct what it looked like. A year later, the fossils had been better prepared out, and they're beginning to focus in a little bit more. It's kind of tubby looking in this reconstruction. But even at that time, Osborne was aware they were onto something new. Carnivorous dinosaurs weren't new. They had been known since the earliest days of the 1800s, the 1820s, when Megalosaurus was named. And even big carnivorous dinosaurs weren't new. Megalosaurus was an animal that ran about 20 feet long or so. Allosaurus had been discovered in the 1870s, 30 feet or so. Tyrannosaurus, though, was even larger still. It dwarfed those previous discoveries. And as even better specimens were found, people got a much better sense of what it looked like. This was the classic mount of Tyrannosaurus Rex at the American Museum. Recently, 1990s, remounted. It's the one on my tie. And if you've ever seen the Jurassic Park movies or books or toys or video games or whatever the franchise is now, you've seen this specimen. That's part of the logo. So Tyrannosaurus became an iconic dinosaur in the early 20th century. It made its way into cartoons, comic books, novels, early stop-motion animation movies, and so forth. And it's really well known to people. But not always well known are certain aspects of it. There's some misconceptions that that Tyrannosaurus has acquired. A lot of people think that Tyrannosaurus was the largest dinosaur. It wasn't. It was big as a meat eater goes, but it was dwarfed by many of the plant eaters. In fact, it was dwarfed by at least one plant eater in its own environment. This is a brand new mount in Dallas of T-Rex. That's an adult T-Rex next to the largest animal in its environment. Here they are in silhouette. It's a plant eater called Alamosaurus. Alamosaurus has actually been known for quite some time, but we didn't know how big it was because it turned out the first specimens found were not fully grown. And new discoveries of it show that Alamosaurus is as big as the largest dinosaurs known elsewhere in the world. So we can now say that North America now has a dinosaur that rivals the giants of Argentina and of China. So T-Rex is big, but it's not the biggest dinosaur. Nor is it even the biggest meat-eating dinosaur. There are other flesh-eating dinosaurs that were at least as large or larger. Among them are giant allosaurs, such as Giganotosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus and Mapusaurus, a cluster of shark-toothed dinosaurs, the Carcharodontosaurs. And another group that's larger still, the Spinosaurs, although they kind of cheat because the Spinosaurs, although they ate the flesh of other dinosaurs, we have the digested remains of dinosaurs in their bellies, they also ate big fish. So they're sampling from various parts of the ecosystem. But even if it's not the largest, Tyrannosaurus is one of the most impressive. And it is, here's a reconstruction of Carcharodontosaurus facing off with Spinosaurus. These guys are actually contemporaries. So it was an environment where we had at least two T-Rex-sized predators in the same environment. So T-Rex is the one in purple in here. And we see it's got a lot of rivals among other giant meat eaters and a giant plant-eating, meat-eating dinosaur. Yeah, okay. So nature is what nature is, and it doesn't have to obey our rules and our names. So just like today, we have pandas, which are members of a group called carnivora. So we have bamboo-eating carnivores. So too, in the age of dinosaurs, there were plant-eating members of the meat-eating dinosaur group. But Tyrannosaurus was the largest of its own particular group. So now it shifted color to red. T-Rex is the largest of its own family of dinosaurs. And by a margin there. So that's Tyrannosaurus Rex. This is, in fact, the original specimen, now at the Carnegie Museum, recently remounted into this nice pose. And it's just one of a cluster of closely related forms, including things like Tarbosaurus, Daspletosaurus, Gorgosaurus, Albertosaurus, and Oleoramus. And except for Oleoramus, which is smaller and it's got these little horns down its nose, there's about 5 people in the world who could tell these guys apart or care. But they're all really built on the same body plan. It's just T-Rex is the heavy SUV version, and some of these other ones are, the sports car version and the, whatever, the minivan. So all variations on the same basic body plan, and collectively they're called the Tyrannosauridae. So that's simply the old taxonomy. It means idae is of the family of, so of the family of Tyrannosaurus. Or Tyrannosaurid if we're talking about it not in its formal Latin phase. So the Tyrannosaurids, Tyrannosauridae, are actually latecomers in the history of dinosaurs. So the oldest dinosaurs are down around here, near the transition between the Middle Triassic and the Late Triassic. Well, let's just say So the oldest dinosaurs around here. Classic dinosaurs like Stegosaurus and Allosaurus and Brachiosaurus are here in the Late Jurassic. T-Rex and company are towards the end. The Great Extinction is this red line right here. And we are at the top of this diagram. And something to consider is we are closer in time to Tyrannosaurus Rex than Tyrannosaurus Rex was to Stegosaurus. More time separates Stegosaurus and T-Rex than separates T-Rex and us. So there's not just one world of dinosaurs, but many worlds of dinosaurs. And for most of that dinosaurian history, it was the allosaurs and the megalosaurs, like spinosaurids, that were the largest body predators. Tyrannosaurids were latecomers in that history. They also had sort of a limited range. So T-Rex and its kin, the Tyrannosaurids, were limited to this part of the world, Western North America, extending over the Bering Land Bridge to Eastern and Central Asia, China, Mongolia, Uzbekistan, and so forth, down into Southeast Asia. Separated from the rest of North America by the shallow seaway, except possibly at that very tail end, and separated from the rest of Eurasia by another shallow seaway, and totally separated from the southern continents. So Tyrannosaurids were not a global phenomenon, but the community they lived with are really well studied. Because these are the dinosaurs found in the western interior, a place which is relatively easy to get to, which is very dry, and so therefore there's not a lot of ground covering that covers up where the fossils are, and because there's been a long history of study there. We know these dinosaurs pretty well. They're familiar to every young person out here. Horned dinosaurs, dome heads, duckbills, armored dinosaurs, club-tailed armored dinosaurs. This fauna, this community of dinosaurs, was essentially limited to Western North America and to Eastern and Central Asia in the late Cretaceous. And just so here are some of T-Rex's contemporaries. Torosaurus, or is it Triceratops? I'm not going to deal with that fight. Just to say, for those of you who aren't up on your dinosaur news, there is a question as to whether this represents a second large three-horned dinosaur at the end of the Age of Dinosaurs, or the final adult phase of Triceratops. And that hasn't been settled yet, and that remains, science is about asking questions, and we don't always get the answers right away. Or club-tailed Ankylosaurus here, another inhabitant of this community. So, and that's a little intro of Tyrannosaurus, but how do we understand how they live? We can't just sit back and film them. We can't watch them, behave. They're not behaving anymore. They just lie there. So we have to use the fossil evidence in order to tell that. And really, what that is a bunch of bones. So the fossil record shows us that Tyrannosaurus Rex almost definitely had a bunch of bones. Yes, it did. There are some other types of fossils we can use. Occasionally we get tracks, although there are only a couple prints which are attributable to Tyrannosaurus Rex itself. Sometimes we have other types of marks in the fossil record, what we call trace fossils. So most fossils we think about are the body fossils, the things that were once part of the living thing. Shells, teeth, leaves, bones, etc. But there's also trace fossils, the record of the behavior of animals that's left in the fossil record. And sometimes they can help inform us about how these creatures lived. And I'll have a little bit of trace fossil evidence in tyrannosaur behavior in a bit. So I'm going to look at a couple different aspects of tyrannosaur biology here. The main thing I'm going to focus on is feeding in tyrannosaurs, because let's face it, that's really cool. You know, these are some of the largest flesh-eating animals on land in the history of life. That's what makes them impressive. But I'll also talk about a couple other issues. I'll talk about locomotion a little bit, and I'll talk about growth in these forms, how they grew, how they changed through time, before I get onto the origin question. So here's T-Rex and the giant Allosaur Giganotosaurus to scale with each other. Giganotosaurus is 2 meters, so 6'6", from the edge of the snout to the back of the jaw joint. T-Rex a little smaller, but not that much smaller. And in general, they look pretty similar. They're big, scary, toothy things, but there are details to distinguish the two of them. So something that makes T-Rex and its relatives different, a couple things. One, they tend to have the nasal bones fused together. These are the bones that run down the top of your face. In our case, they're relatively short, but dinosaurs have very long faces. They tend to have long nasals. And in Tyrannosaurs, they fuse up to a single bone, and they do so really early in the history of the group and in the life of any individual. And also, Tyrannosaurs tend to have incisors. That's weird for a reptile. Most reptiles don't have incisors. That is, the teeth in the very front of the jaw are normally pretty similar to the ones in the rest of the jaw. And in many dinosaurs, there's distinction. You can recognize what we call the premaxillary teeth from the maxillary teeth, but they're sort of grayed into each other. In Tyrannosaurs, that's not the case. In fact, when the first Tyrannosaur premaxillary teeth were found without skeletons attached, they were thought to be evidence of a giant mammal from the end of the age of dinosaurs. They looked kind of like mammal incisors, but they're not. They're dinosaur incisors. So here's our view from the underside. And they're little scrapey teeth. They have serrations on them. They have little cutting edges, but both rows of serrations are on the back of the tooth, and they're much smaller than the other teeth. And trace fossil evidence from bite marks on duckbill dinosaurs from Asia suggests that Tyrannosaurs used those teeth to scrape the meat off, sort of delicately, off the bone when they're either finishing up or maybe trying to get a muscle detached to munch down on it. But of course, the teeth that interest most people are the rest of the teeth. So those are the little incisor-like ones. Here are those giant, massive ones. And despite almost every popular book and documentary to the contrary, they did not have steak knife-like teeth. Because the teeth of Tyrannosaurs are almost as thick side to side as they are front to back, and that's not the shape of a steak knife. It would be really hard to cut anything with that. There are many meat eaters. In fact, the ancestral or original condition in meat-eating dinosaurs is a steak knife-like tooth. And in fact, if I had a complete one here, the crown, the part that sticks up above the gum line, and the root, the stuff that dips down into the socket, are about the same length in a typical, ordinary meat-eating dinosaur tooth. In Tyrannosaurs, it's different. They're very thick from side to side, and the root is twice as long as the crown. So they're much more deeply anchored and much thicker from side to side. And these are not cutting teeth. These are pulverizing, crushing, piercing teeth. At least that's what they look like. And so that's one thing we could do. We can look at these teeth and begin to infer how they used it from the morphology, that is, the shape. Additionally, if we look at the inside of the snouts of meat-eating dinosaurs, most meat-eating dinosaurs, here's an allosaur called Sinraptor, for instance, they don't have a solid roof on their mouth. So if you stick your tongue at the top of behind your teeth in your mouth, you'll find a layer of bone going across there. And because mammals have that. That's normal for mammals. A crocodile that would do the same thing would feel that. A typical dinosaur would not. They were like a lizard or a snake. They don't have a hard palate in front. Tyrannosaurs did. They did have a hard palate. They were more like a crocodile, more like a mammal in that context. But what does that suggest? That does suggest, in terms of the biomechanics, and some computer studies have helped support this, that Tyrannosaurs could do something most meat-eating dinosaurs couldn't. Most meat-eating dinosaurs had jaws that were pretty strong when they clamped down on something, but not so much when they tried to twist side to side. It's not as strong. And in fact, along the top of the skull, they'd have a lot of pressure building up. In contrast, Tyrannosaurus with that solid palate, and remember I mentioned they have those fused nasals, can actually clamp down and twist and turn or hold on to things which are twisting and turning and not suffer as much stress in the skull. They're better able to absorb it. So they have better strength in what we call torsion, which is twisting. So they seem to have fed differently, and that's consistent with the shape of the teeth. Instead of being steak knives that just cut and slice through things, these pierce, crunch, hold, and then twist. A different mode of feeding that's been called puncture and pull, as opposed to the bite and slice of a typical meat eater. So a different approach to taking down its prey items or eating things that they found that were already dead. Now, related to that, if you look at the faces of Tyrannosaurs and other meat-eating dinosaurs, they're different shapes. And these aren't distorted. These are actually pretty good skulls in both cases. Typical meat-eating dinosaurs have very narrow faces. Tyrannosaurs have very wide faces, rounded snouts, big wide backs of the head. And I'll come to some of the implication of that in a bit in terms of their senses. So from these lines of evidence, those of us who work on tyrannosaur biology have suggested that tyrannosaurs actually fed in a different fashion than the other dinosaurs, that they had this puncture and pull method, that they use their jaws to both capture the prey and also to take it down. But it would be good to have independent evidence. And so we looked for it, and there it is. We have cases of the horns of Triceratops that have been bitten off and re-healed. So it was an animal that was alive that had a horn that was bitten off where the puncture marks matched the bite of a Tyrannosaurus. We also have the backs of the rear end of a duckbill dinosaur that got munched on and re-healed, and the shape of the bite matches Tyrannosaurus, or it would match the bite of a Tyrannosaurus-like animal in an environment where the only giant predator known is Tyrannosaurus. The simpler explanation is it was Tyrannosaurus, and since that bite was re-healed, that was a living animal. And that's an important thing about the question of whether Tyrannosaurus would go after large-bodied prey while they were alive. Some of my colleagues, one of my colleagues, thinks that it fed exclusively on carrion, on already dead animals. And certainly it would have, because, it doesn't fight back. But live animals, which do fight back, seem to have been on the diet, and the reason we can tell that is because we have these cases of failed predation. And only cases of failed predation where the prey got away are going to be recognizably different than scavenging. Because when you eat a dead thing, or if you kill something and eat it, the bite marks are going to look the same because it was kind of dead and it can't heal. But if it's something that got away, it could heal so you know that it was bitten while it was alive. But do we really have evidence that this was bite marks from a T-Rex? Is it really going into the belly of the T-Rex? Well, the way to find that is to see what comes out of the belly of a T-Rex. This is a T-Rex poop. Yes, we have fossilized poop. They're called coprolites, which means poop stone. Really. And it's about 2 liters big, so think of a 2-liter bottle of soda, that big. And inside of it are the, I thought I had images of that, are the partially digested bones of small plant-eating dinosaurs that were crushed and pulverized the way the teeth of a Tyrannosaurus could do and no other meat eater. So that's good evidence that Tyrannosaurus would munch down on its prey in ways that bite and slice predators would not. Of course, Tyrannosaurus is famous for one thing that's really small, and that's its dinky little arms. That's it. That's its arms. It cannot, its 2 hands couldn't reach each other. It couldn't reach the mouth. It couldn't reach lots of things. That's why they were so angry. So, what do they use them for? Well, I think the big solution is they didn't use them very much, and that's why they were so small. Their body didn't put a lot of energy into building them. And it's true that the later tyrannosaurs have proportionately smaller arms. In fact, the Asian cousin of Tyrannosaurus, called Tarbosaurus, has proportionally even smaller arms and hands than T-Rex. So it looks like they were on their way out. maybe if the extinction event didn't occur, tyrannosaurs that lived into 20 million years, 30 million years, 40 million years later may have lost their arms altogether. But that's pure speculation. Although, technology could help out. So something that has been the research of colleagues of mine, primarily out of Ohio, have been looking at, can we reconstruct the senses of Tyrannosaurus or other fossil animals? And in some cases, it looks like we can, because of attributes with regard to parts of the body that preserve details associated with the sense organs or with the computer that runs the sense organs, and that's the brain. So, for example, we can look at the placement of the eyes. So here's T-Rex with eyeballs in place, and here's a big allosaur, Acrocanthosaurus. Its eyeballs would go there and there. And it shows us something. T-Rex could look right at you. And what that means is with both eyes focusing on the same target, they've got a lot of depth perception. Because in order to get depth perception, you need light signal coming from two different eyes, and then the brain adds it up and tells you how far something is. Something like an Acrocanthosaurus or an Allosaurus didn't have as much overlap. It had some. It had much better vision off to the side, much greater peripheral vision, but less concentrated depth perception in front. In part, this may have to do with the type of prey they're going after. Acrocanthosaurus is a dinosaur that's going after basically big walking walls of meat, which are the long-necked plant eaters. There were, as I showed, there are a few long-necked plant eaters in Tyrannosaurus's world, but they were relatively rare. Whereas in the world of Acrocanthosaurus, there's a lot of these big ones, and you don't really have to be that precise to see where they are. But Tyrannosaurus is up against armored dinosaurs like Ankylosaurus, or horned dinosaurs like Triceratops, or dinosaurs like the duckbills that have some evidence for complex social behaviors, where getting in really precisely might be really advantageous, to get in there, get that blow in, and take it down. Something you might not think might be easily preservable, but turns out there's some evidence for, is the ability to smell. So how well did Tyrannosaurus smell? Probably stank. But, but the brains of dinosaurs and other meat-eating, and other vertebrate animals, other animals with backbones, have the same part of the brain in the same spots all across the vertebrate kingdom. So we can tell where the parts of the brain associated with smelling are, and where the parts associated with vision are, where the parts associated with balance are, and so forth. And you can actually use a CT scan on a fossil, just like you can on a living human, and reconstruct the shape of the brain. So there's the brain of T-Rex, not that much there. Okay, not that much there for mammals, okay. For dinosaurs, I should point out, that's twice as much brain as Carcharodontosaurus has at the same body size. So T-Rex has to represent. So, and we can look at the part of the brain associated with smell. And it's been noticed for a long time that it's quite large in Tyrannosaurs. And so they got a lot of good computing associated with the sense of smell, and potentially would have a very good sense of smell. Now, some of my colleagues, well, one of my colleagues, has used that as evidence for Tyrannosaurs being obligate scavengers, that they only scavenge, because it's true that there are some modern birds, the turkey vulture, with this phenomenal sense of smell. And yes, it would be good to be able to find carrion from a long distance, but we also have modern predators with a really good sense of smell, I think wolves. So just because you have a good sense of smell doesn't mean you're a hunter or a scavenger, it just means you have a good sense of smell. So if we plot the relative size of those olfactory bulbs against the body size, and we see down this line, that's typical meat-eating dinosaurs, so those are like the big allosaurs and so forth. It's true that tyrannosaurs have these really disproportionately large smelling parts of the brain, as does one other group of meat-eaters, and that's the raptors. So if my colleague was being honest, he would use this as evidence that Velociraptor was an obligate scavenger, and therefore was incapable of taking down prey. I've never heard him actually say that. So, despite all these documentaries he's been on about that. Anyway, so Yeah, so basically, it looks like we have two different groups of meat eaters that have really, really good sense of sensory equipment here. Now, what about the running ability of Tyrannosaurus and other tyrant dinosaurs? Well, they're really big animals. They probably, at least as adult size, didn't spend too much of the time all out running, because simply by that sheer mass, that would be dangerous. If they tripped and fell, that's a lot of weight coming down from, from 10 feet up in the air, crashing down. That's where the belly is, coming crashing down. That's a nasty fall. But can we say anything more than that? Well, if you look at the hind limbs, the legs of Tyrannosaurus, and compare them to other meat eaters, they have a funny-looking foot if you compare it to a more typical one. There's Majungasaurus here, looking straight on. Here's a Tarbosaurus, a Tyrannosaur, and Allosaurus. In most meat-eating dinosaurs, this middle long bone of the foot is about as wide as the other two from top to bottom. That's normal. But if you look at the foot bones of Tyrannosaur, this middle one is a wedge with a pinched out middle here, and it's a lot more proportionally skinnier and longer for the same size. And so I and then various other colleagues since have looked at the implications of this. For one thing, we can show that mathematically it really is demonstrably bigger. So these red squares are the Tyrannosaurs. Let's put these guys up here. So you know all these. Okay. So there's Tyrannosaurs. And these are the ostrich dinosaurs, ornithomimosaurs. If you've ever seen the first Jurassic Park movie, that's the flock that goes running over the kids at one point. Here are the giant allosaurs and so forth. And so most of the big meat eaters have shorter feet for the same body size than do tyrannosaurs or these ostrich dinosaurs or most of the other dinosaurs down this line who have this same piston structure in the foot. So they have a longer foot, a skinnier foot, a more interlocked foot for the same body size, which are attributes in the modern world we associate with faster moving animals. Does that mean that T-Rex ran as fast as racehorses? No, probably not. It didn't have to, though. It wasn't chasing racehorses. It was chasing duckbills and horned dinosaurs, and its foot is a lot longer proportionately than in those dinosaurs. So all you have to do is be faster than the animals that are in your environment. You don't have to be faster than hypothetical creatures from 66 million years in the future. One really important line of evidence of the lifestyle of dinosaurs and other fossil animals that's come to light in the last few years is our ability to reconstruct how they grew through time. And there's a way to do this, and it requires samples. It requires a number of individuals. You can't tell it from just one individual. But if we have multiple individuals at different growth stages, we can begin to reconstruct the life cycle of dinosaurs. And this is actually a reconstruction of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different growth stages of Tyrannosaurus Rex to scale with each other. And in fact, the little guy, that one there he is, 2-year-old. And I'll explain in a moment how we know it's 2 years old. Here's an 11-year-old, Jane. That's the name of the individual. We don't know if it's female or not. That's the big one from Carnegie, an older individual. Well, it turns out that dinosaurs, like many types of vertebrates, actually have tree ring-like growth in their bones. They lay down this so-called line of arrested growth about once a year. So if you've got a fossil, you can slice into some of the bones and count up the growth rings. The largest number of rings you have is the minimum age that dinosaur could have been. So you've got an age. But you also have the dinosaur size. If you've got enough of the skeleton, you know how big it was. So if you plot the size of the individual versus the age of the individual, you can do a growth curve. We can also see when they stopped growing. This is a rib of the giant T-Rex specimen Sue, and it shows that at about age 19, after that point, those growth rings just stack right on top of each other. We call it the external fundamental system, and it means it stopped growing rapidly. It reached a basically full-size individual at that point. So we can map out growth curves of these guys. And when it turns out with tyrannosaurs, they start out really small, so that square, that's that 2-year-old. And then they hit a rapid growth phase. In tyrannosaurs, it seems to be around 11 or 12. goes up for a while, peters out around age 19 or 20, and then they reach full size at about 20. And if we ignored the body mass, that could be a human growth curve. Little baby, growing up as a kid, sort of a stable growth, rapid growth around age 11 or 12, petering out at about 11 or 19, and then, little growth afterwards, but not much in terms of adding length. So we now can look at the growth cycles of dinosaurs, which is something we couldn't do before. Now, one last major field of research that I've been involved with here, and that is reconstructing where Tyrannosaurus and its kin came from. Because for a long time, our fossil record was a lot more spotty than it is now. That means we didn't have as many time layers and spots around the world, so we didn't have as many dots to connect up. And so prior to the 1980s, there were sort of two different arguments of where Tyrannosaurus came from. There's Tyrannosaurus, there's Gorgosaurus, its earlier, lighter-built cousin. One idea is that it was a super carnosaur, as I used to call this idea. That is, it was the last in a line of meat eaters that included the allosaurs. And so they inherited giant size from giant-sized ancestors. However, as early as the 1920s, people had noticed some attributes, some skeletal features of tyrannosaurs that were more like the little bitty dinosaurs. And actually, this guy up here is projected larger. These are both projected larger than life size. That's pretty close to life size. It's projected here. That there were features of the skeleton of tyrannosaurs that were more like these little guys than were like these giants. And so maybe the little raptor dinosaurs were where the tyrannosaurs came from. Well, that was a question because we didn't really have a method to choose and sort out between that. That changed in the 1980s and 90s when a new type of technique for sorting out evolutionary relationships was developed. And this technique, which looks at the pattern of observations of transformations of evolution and sorts out the simplest explanation for any set of data, started to recover the fact that tyrannosaurs were, in fact, descendants of small-bodied meat-eaters and not descendants of giant meat-eaters, that they were little birdie dinosaurs grown huge. So tyrannosaurs were part of this larger group called the Coelurosaurs that included some of those little guys I showed before, but also this group, the raptor dinosaurs, the ostrich dinosaurs, and the birds. Because one of the other things that came out of these studies is that birds are not relatives of the dinosaurs. They are a type of dinosaur. In fact, they are a type of Maniraptoriform Coelurosaur dinosaur. And the tyrannosaurs were actually pretty close to birds. They weren't really super close to birds, but they were closer to birds than they were to allosaurs or megalosaurs and so forth. But still, all that was based where we had the tyrannosaurids of the late Cretaceous and then not much beforehand. And in the last decade and a half, that has changed. These are all the new tyrannosaurs that have been named in the 21st century. That's a lot of them. And many of these are really complete skeletons. A couple of these are actually within Tyrannosauridae itself, among the giants, but a lot of these aren't. And additionally, with the information from these skeletons, we were able to see that some previously named dinosaurs, some named as early as the 1860s, were actually also Tyrannosauroids, member of the larger group. And there's a handful that maybe they are, maybe they aren't. It's hard to say. So our understanding of tyrannosaur evolution has greatly increased. And one of the things that we've discovered is that they greatly increased, that they really, really dramatically rose in size, because most of those tyrannosauroids are small dinosaurs or medium-sized dinosaurs. So we filled in a gap not only of time, but also of size, running from little bitty ones to medium-sized ones to larger ones on up to the great giants of the late Cretaceous. And they also tell us something about the transformations that they went through. For example, here's an early tyrannosaur called Guanlong, the crowned dragon. It's got long arms. It's got 3 fingers with great big claws. They still had really long grasping arms like most meat eaters. But it had those fused nasals, and it had those premaxillary teeth that looked like incisors that showed it's a tyrannosauroid. So that was one of the skeletons. Here's a drawing of the more complete one of Guanlong. And there's a restoration of what it looks like. Long-armed, fast-running, medium-sized predator. Or little Dilong. Dilong's a little guy, probably not much more than 6 feet long as an adult. There's its skull. It's got those little U-shaped incisor teeth. It's got its fused nasals, and it's got feathers. Or at least it's got fuzz. It's got little fuzzy projections coming off the body, which we had already discovered among some of the other meat-eating dinosaurs from China from the same rocks that it was found in. And we were beginning to guess that because other Coelurosaurs had this fuzz, that Tyrannosaurs might as well. But Dilong was the first one to show it. But with those discoveries, said, okay, maybe Dilong, a little bitty guy, a 6-footer, had fuzz on its body. But surely a giant Tyrannosaur wouldn't. And there's logic behind that. After all, if you think about it, look at an African elephant or an Indian elephant. They're mostly hairless, even though we know they come from furry animals. And most of their smaller relatives are very furry. So maybe T-Rex and other giant tyrannosaurs would have been not so much fuzzy. Well, that's a reconstruction of Dilong. Last year, this guy came to light. Tyrannus, known from 3 nearly complete skeletons, preserved in the same type of lake deposits that preserve those sort of filaments. And there are 2 of the good skeletons that actually overlap. And it was covered with fuzz. A 1.4-ton giant with fuzz on the body, about 8 inches long, that looked for all the world like the little fuzzy feathers coming off of emus and cassowaries. So now we can't say that the giant tyrannosaurs were necessarily just scaly, that at least some of them were fuzzy. Now, at present, we have never found T-Rex in an environment that would preserve the body covering to any great degree. They haven't found him in lake deposits. So we cannot yet reject the idea that they were fuzzy, because if we see this is the distribution on the family tree of this filament or fuzziness, true feathers so far are limited to this one group. That is, with a branch and branches coming off of that and branches coming off of that. But all these other ones have fuzz. And so our simplest explanation is that fuzz evolved in their common ancestor, and that tyrannosaurids, like T-Rex, were fuzzy animals. So weird as it is, we may have to start getting used to this image of T-Rex. You know, a lot of us are more comfortable now, maybe juveniles like this, this is a representation of the 2-year-old being fuzzy, but, maybe even the adults kept it on part of the body. And, pure speculation and literally arm waving here. Maybe that's what those little tiny arms were still for. Maybe they were still signaling with them, just the way some flightless birds can signal with their otherwise useless wings. Again, pure speculation. Until we find the impression of that, we don't know they had feathers on their arms. Well, there's a lot of things we want to know about tyrannosaurs. What were their social behaviors like? What was their other aspects of their biology? We think of Tyrannosaurus as being very spectacular because it was the last and greatest of the tyrannosaurs, but that's really by accident. It wasn't doomed, it wasn't destined to be the largest and the last. They could have gone on beyond. Who knows what would have happened? T-Rex was unlucky enough, like this individual, to live at a time when giant rocks fall out of the sky and brought the world of the tyrannosaurs to an end. So T-Rex was the very last of the giant tyrannosaurs, and they lived to see the day when the great cataclysm ended the age of the giant dinosaurs and allowed the fuzzballs, the mammals, who had been with the dinosaurs since the very beginning, to take over the earth. So I just wanted to end there. And the end of the Tyrannosaurs with a very brief overview of the life of these creatures. There's still plenty more to discover about them, and I don't even know what questions to ask, and that's the important thing, is that people are discovering new techniques all the time and new approaches to ask questions that we can get information out of the fossil record to bring these wonderful creatures to life. So thank you.
The next question is from Jake from Redmond, Washington. He said, How fast can the average Tyrannosaurus go? He wants them in miles per hour.
In miles per hour. Right now, it's easy to answer at 0. But back then, that's a really good question. And I wish I could answer you, but I can't. And here to turn the question around, how fast is any given animal today? And we don't know. And when you watch a TV show or you look at a book about animals, really we know the actual top speeds of just a handful of animals that we can run under a controlled condition to see how fast they are. Most wild animals, we're not able to do that. We can't train them. And honest to goodness, this is the way how they track how fast wild animals are going. They get in the Range Rover, they're in the Serengeti. How fast are we going? 25. Is the wildebeest going that fast? I don't know about that. 25 miles an hour is how fast the wildebeest goes. So because we don't know how fast modern animals are, for the most part, it becomes that much more difficult to try to reconstruct how fast an animal who lived in conditions different than us, different levels of oxygen in the environment, that might be different power to the muscles arranged in fashions different than any living animal. I mean, the same basic patterns, but different sizes. Too many question marks in there to get a real good number. I'd love to know what it is, though.
Okay. Next question is from Virginia. She's a student here at the University of Washington. I've always wondered, with dinosaurs being so big, how would they manage to reproduce without crushing each other?
I guess the answer was very carefully. But obviously they did it. Some people have suggested maybe some of them went into the water to do it. Maybe, I don't know. But some of them were in really dry environments. So the ones that make me wonder are some of the spiked back guys. I don't.
So I got a follow-up question here from Jacob from Port Angeles, Washington. He was wondering, do you think T-Rex would brood its eggs?
Yeah, that's a great question. We know that some of the group that I call Maniraptoriformes, the ostrich dinosaurs, the oviraptors, the raptor dinosaurs, did brood their nests. That we have the nests and the skeletons to show that. We even have nests of Tyrannosaur-sized oviraptors that brooded their nests. And now we have kind of goodish evidence that even big Tyrannosaurs were fuzzy, and one of the aspects of fuzziness could be for brooding. We don't yet have a Tyrannosaurid nest or a Tyrannosauroid nest, and I'd love to see what they look like. If you go a little further down the tree, that is the evolutionary family tree, we start running into meat eaters that don't have a big space in the middle of their nest for the parent to sit down in. And those ones probably didn't brood it directly. They were probably more like alligators and crocodiles and a couple group of primitive birds that sort of cover it with vegetation or arrange vegetation around it. But for Tyrannosaurs themselves, we don't know. It's a really good question.
Next question is from Tony. He's from Tukwila. Did Tyrannosaurids have rocks or gizzards to help digest food?
You know, we have yet to find gizzard stones, or gastroliths is a technical name, in Tyrannosaurids. They are known in some other members of the Theropoda, the meat-eating dinosaurs, including some which were meat-eaters. And sometimes people think that gizzard stones are just for plant eaters, and many plant eaters do use them. But there's a meat-eater from Portugal called Lourençosaurus, and it had gizzard stones in its belly. So it's not unthinkable that Tyrannosaurus would have them, but we have a fair number of pretty complete skeletons that were found out in the field, and to my knowledge, no one's ever reported them in there.
Marcus from Bellingham wants to know how wide a T-Rex could open his mouth.
Yeah, that's about right. So yeah, we could look at the jaw joint, and they could open it pretty deep. They probably had to get around the legs of animals to sort of get a big bite off of them.
Question from Rick from Redmond. What major should an undergraduate study if they want to become a paleontologist?
There's sort of two big approaches to doing paleontology, because paleontology really is the overlap of two fields. You either have to be a biologist who knows a heck of a lot of geology, or a geologist who knows a heck of a lot of biology. And depending upon what university you go to, you might be a place where, like for example, at my university, all the vertebrate paleontologists are in the Department of Geology, so that's where you'd want to go. And when I was an undergraduate, that's what I did, because I even took human anatomy at Hopkins in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, because they didn't teach it in biology, because that involved things bigger than a cell. At some universities, it's all over in the biology department, and that's where all the whole organismal biologists are, and the geologists are just geophysicists and so forth. And at some universities, you've got them in both departments, and that's great, because then, who knows, you can maybe even double major. Check with your advisors to see if that's appropriate. So.
Nina from Seattle has seems like a little bit more technical question for you.
Okay.
Is there any evidence supporting Nano Tyrannus as either a young Tyrannosaurus or its own species?
Right. Yeah, that is a big question in the tiny little field of Tyrannosaur studies. So there's a skeleton. Let's see. I'll try to back up to it while I'm doing this. A skeleton that's called Jane, and another one that's a skull called Nano Tyrannus, where there's a question as to whether, there we go, there's Jane, whether this is a distinct, separate type of Tyrannosaur, or whether it is the growth stage, the early teenager of Tyrannosaurus Rex. Now, I think the conclusive evidence to reject the idea that it is a juvenile Tyrannosaurus is either the discovery of a juvenile Tyrannosaurus of exactly the same growth stage that has more features with Tyrannosaurus Rex than this skeleton does, or an adult of this animal which is clearly not Tyrannosaurus Rex. But so far, every Nanotyrannus found is a juvenile at a stage we otherwise don't have juvenile T-Rexes. So I think until one of those other things are discovered, the simplest explanation is this is a young T-Rex. That Nanotyrannus is just a growth stage of Tyrannosaurus. Happy to be wrong, because that means there's one more Tyrannosaur species. But we need that evidence in order to say it's a distinct form.
Great. Lena from Seattle wants to know, if T-Rex had fuzz, would it be wiry or soft?
Ooh. That's a good question, and I don't know that we've got really a good way of answering that at the moment. Now, from what we see of these long filaments coming off of them, they're sort of like down, but the problem is no living bird still has that really ancestral proto-bird structure. All living birds are descendants of animals that have, as their basic adult plumage, a single shaft with branches coming off and branches coming off that, and down is sort of like a degeneration of that, kind of, but not exactly. Developmental biology, you gotta love it. So we don't have anything today that produces, so far as I know, that produces filaments that are exactly like these things we see on Tyrannus and D. long and so forth. My expectation would be kind of soft, but it's hard to say. We could be wrong.
Deborah from Bellevue wants to know, what are your general thoughts on whether T-Rex was or wasn't warm-blooded?
Ooh, yeah. I think we can reject, for a number of lines of evidence, the idea that any dinosaur was cold-blooded in the sense of any modern cold-blooded reptile. There's too many attributes of them. Their rapid, super rapid growth rate. There's some biomechanical evidence that in order to move a body of this size, you have to have a warm-blooded metabolism, given the amount of muscles they have in them and the fact they're way up above the ground and so forth, that they almost certainly weren't cold-blooded in the sense of their contemporary lizards and snakes and turtles and so forth. A complicating factor in this whole warm-bloodedness, cold-bloodedness debate is that part of metabolism is what's going on inside your body, and part of what your metabolism is what you're taking in from the outside. And the outside world was different back then, including the relative amount of CO2, the relative amount of oxygen. That may have affected the relative amount of productivity of plants at the base of the food chain. It may have affected the rates of production of heat in the body. It may have been easier to have been warm-blooded in the age of dinosaurs than it is now. I would say, with all that arm waving going on there, the effective end product is they would have been as active as a mammal today. How they got to that activity level is yet another and really complicated question. But I think in terms of the way it's expressed would be rather continuous activity expressed pretty much the way it would look like if you were at the big cat house or the big elephant house or whatever at a zoo, and not what you would see in the reptile house.
Okay, I'm going to ask 2 more questions.
Okay.
So, the same question from a couple of different people, Christopher from Tacoma and Noah from Seattle. Basically want to know, how long did T-Rex live? What was the lifespan of a T-Rex?
Right. At present, that T-Rex called Sue, the one that's at the Field Museum in Chicago, is the one that they've counted the most rings on. And she was between 28 years old and 29 years old when she died. There is another one that's called Scotty that they haven't finished. It's a little more obscure. It looks like it may have been in its early 30s when it died, but we don't see him older than that. It looks like dinosaurs lived fast and died young, that they didn't have to have really long lives. Well, they didn't have really long lifespan, and there's probably a reason for that, and that is to turn the question around is why do big mammals live so long? Big mammals like elephants and rhinos live so long because it takes them a long time to reproduce offspring, that the gestation period in a big mammal, well, in mammals it scales against body size, so that a horse takes, 9 months or so, a rhino a year, an elephant 2 years, an Andricothere, the giant rhinos of the middle of the Cenozoic, might have been 3 years, and you get one baby after that. And that means you need to live a long time in order to have enough offspring that you've got another next generation. Dinosaurs are popping out eggs like nobody's business. So, a couple dozen every year. You don't need to have selection for a really, really long lifespan in order to be able to reproduce. So there's no reason to hang around. Lots of babies, boom, you're dead. Next generation, boom, lots of babies. So they didn't need to live a long time.
Okay, last question is from Alex from Redmond. He wants to know, where's the best place to find a T-Rex?
Yeah, best places to find T-Rexes would be places like Wyoming and Montana and Colorado and South Dakota. Those 4 states have produced the vast majority of T-Rex specimens. There have been some that have been found up in the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. There's been some found in Denver. There's limited remains southwest of that. But the best place, the place where the vast majority have been found, are Montana and Wyoming and South Dakota and a little bit more in Colorado. But